So way back in my Judgment review, I said this. I absolutely do recommend Judgment, but I'd have a hard time recommending it over any of the Yakuza games. Well, I think I may have come across the first Yakuza game I would not recommend over Judgment, but thankfully I've also found yet another amazing entry in the Yakuza series at the same time. So let's talk about them, shall we? For a very brief refresher on my experience with Yakuza, I was a latecomer to the series. Yakuza 0 was my first entry, but I fell in love with it almost instantly. From 0, I played the series as they released. Kiwami, Yakuza 6, Kiwami 2. I've never once been confused by the stories, and every one of them has been immensely enjoyable to me. I have no doubt that I might have gotten something extra from the series if I'd played them in order, but jumping back and forth has had no negative effect on my enjoyment of the individual stories they tell or the games themselves, at all. The reason I didn't just go ahead and play them in order after 0 came down to what was happening with the series at the time. When I played 0, I'd already heard about both Kiwami and Yakuza 6, Kiwami being a remake of the very first game in the newer engine of 0 and 6. By the time 6 had rolled into my life, Kiwami 2 was already announced, and there were rumblings that 3, 4, and 5 would either be getting the Kiwami treatment or would simply have a much smaller scale remaster and re-release on a modern platform. And the latter is what eventually ended up happening, bringing me to this very video. The Yakuza Remastered Collection contains Yakuza 3, 4, and 5, freshly remastered for the PS4, and in terms of the Western release, it's extremely exciting for another reason. They have essentially been re-localized from scratch. This is exciting because previously cut content has been restored to the Western versions, and what I consider to be the absolute best localizers in the industry right now have fixed up a lot of the little translation and localization errors that were present on the PS3 versions. Yakuza 5 wasn't yet available when I started writing this script. It launched alongside the physical release on the 11th, but I decided to start with Yakuza 3 because I got it before Yakuza 5 even released. Now, Yakuza 3 didn't have the greatest reception when it first released. Most people at least know that in the West due to all the cut content, but what you may not know is that it was also heavily criticized in Japan as well. This brand new localized remaster fixes everything that was wrong with the previous Western release, but that still leaves us with everything that wasn't so great to begin with. Yakuza 3 was the first Yakuza game on the PS3. The PS3 was an incredibly difficult console to develop for, especially in the beginning. It has a very complicated cell processor, so many of the earlier games on the consoles just weren't that great. And that was pretty much true of most developers' first game on the console, before they got accustomed to developing for it. Yakuza 3 was RGG's first game on the PS3, and it shows. The controls feel very heavy and clunky, the character proportions feel off, exploring isn't as seamless in this version of the Yakuza engine, the way battles are initiated takes way too long, and so on. It's a myriad of little things mostly, but they all add up to make the gameplay experience worse than the other games in the series that I've played. I do want to stress that it's far from unplayable. It's mostly technically very sound, but it is jarring going from the latest entries back to a game with all the telltale characteristics of an early PS3 title. The reason I ended up putting it down for now in favor of Yakuza 4 was a combination of what I've just talked about and the pacing of the story. I won't go into spoiler territory, but for a good long while you're doing very slow, mundane things in Okinawa. You get brief spurts of the heavy action drama and brilliantly silly humor here and there, but they are just as quickly torn away from you in favor of these long, quiet, emotional moments. For what it's worth, I do actually like all this early stuff in its own right, but the pacing of it all feels way off. The game feels like it's building, and then it gets there right before, bam, the brakes slam on and all momentum, tension, and excitement stops dead in its tracks. I have read that this gets alleviated further into the story, but I just decided that the pacing, along with the early PS3 vibes, was a good reason to swap to Yakuza 4 and come back to Yakuza 3 later. And my goodness, I am absolutely loving Yakuza 4. Well, I should say I was loving it right from the start, and I am loving it now, but there was a point where I wasn't feeling so great about it. We'll get to that in a minute. Yakuza 4 does unfortunately share a few of the annoyances from Yakuza 3. Battles are still much less seamless than the other entries I've played in the series, and it's obviously still using the same engine as 3, but with notable improvements. The characters control a lot better, it doesn't feel as clunky to play, and apart from some hilariously out of proportion hands, the character models feel more integrated into the game world. I don't know what it was about Yakuza 3, but it always looked like Kiryu took up way too much of the screen, like he was towering over the game world. One of the major things about Yakuza 4 is that there are 4 playable characters. This isn't a unique thing for the Yakuza series, but its approach certainly is. The Yakuza narrative, more often than not, focuses in on Kiryu. The games open up with him, you play as him, but when you start Yakuza 4, Kiryu is nowhere in sight. Instead, you're immediately given control of Akiyama, a non-Yakuza who runs a somewhat suspect company called Sky Finance, and I freaking love this guy. Akiyama is badass, just like Kiryu, but in a completely different way. Akiyama is often dismissive and in some ways lazy, usually not looking to interject himself into anything but constantly ending up in the middle of something anyway. The next character the story will put you in control of is Seijima, and this is where the game took a bit of a dive for me. It wasn't so much story related, but rather gameplay related. The cool thing about the 4 different playable characters in Yakuza 4 is that they each feel incredibly unique to play. They have their own fighting styles and specialities. It's cool, but it is also the downfall of Seijima, at least for me. I just hate his fighting style, which is that of a slow but powerful behemoth. He feels sluggish and has a very short consecutive hit combo, instead relying on delayed charge attacks after just 2 or 3 consecutive basic hits. It didn't take long to hit an upswing though, as the next character is Tana Mora, a somewhat dirty street cop who actually nurtures the growing illegal Asian immigrant community. And as you may have noticed here, yep, Kiryu, the lead protagonist for the entire Yakuza series, apart from the most recent Yakuza 7, is actually the last character you get control of in Yakuza 4. He does appear in the game earlier than this, but you don't get control of him until after you've been thoroughly acquainted with the other 3 protagonists. And that's pretty much where I'm at the moment. I'm working on finishing up Yakuza 4, and since Yakuza 5 has now been released as part of the Remastered Collection, I think I'll move on to that before finally going back and finishing 3. I hope I can get it all done before Yakuza 7 presumably releases sometime this year, the first mainline Yakuza to really switch up the format and move to a turn-based combat system. I've been saying it for years already, that Yakuza is basically a JRPG, and now it's getting the battle system to go along with it. In the meantime though, the Yakuza Remastered Collection is pretty amazing value. Even though I'd put Judgment above Yakuza 3, at the early to mid stage of the game I'm at, I'd still classify it as a good game. Yakuza 4 is a great one, and I don't think Yakuza 5 is going to be a crushing disappointment, but I'll be sure to give you some thoughts later down the track. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all soon.
Thanks for the liking, subscribing, and the sharing!